Welcome back to another episode of PsyberSpace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston. Today, we're digging into the intricate psychology of changing minds. This subject is top of mind for everyone lately as society feels more and more disconnected and divided, with everyone holding strong opinions and beliefs. We'll explore various factors that influence our ability, desire, or resistance to shifting our perspectives. One note about this episode. Normally, I keep these episodes under 25 minutes, so they're easy to consume. This topic is complex, and you can expect an episode that will take about 50 minutes. So, get your bookmark ready. You might need to pause this one or listen on 2x speed. Let's start with this. Changing a person's mind is rarely, if ever, about the facts themselves. If it were that simple, we'd all update our beliefs the moment new evidence appeared. But that's not how our brains work, and understanding this is important if we want effective communication. When we encounter information that contradicts our existing beliefs, our brains actually experience it as a threat. This triggers what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable mental tension when two conflicting ideas occupy the same space. What's interesting about cognitive dissonance is that our brains are wired to resolve this discomfort not by objectively evaluating new evidence, but by protecting our existing worldview at almost any cost. We've all watched perfectly rational people perform incredible mental gymnastics to preserve their beliefs rather than face the discomfort of admitting they might be wrong. This protective mechanism manifests in several ways, but confirmation bias is perhaps the most insidious. It's not just that we prefer information that supports what we already believe. Our brains actually process confirming and disconfirming information differently. Studies using brain imaging have shown that when we encounter evidence that supports our existing beliefs, the reward center in the brain light up. We feel good, literally. But when confronted with contradictory evidence, the brain areas associated with negative emotions and pain activate instead. No wonder we're so resistant to changing our minds. It's neurologically uncomfortable. The brain's tendency toward belief perseverance is even more powerful than most people realize. In experimental settings, researchers have demonstrated that people will cling to beliefs even after the original evidence for those beliefs has been completely discredited. In one study, participants were given false information about fire safety, then explicitly told the information was fabricated for the experiment. Despite knowing the information was false, they continued to influence participants' judgments weeks later. Our brains don't easily let go of information once it's been integrated into our mental models. What makes this extra challenging is that we're almost entirely blind to these biases in ourselves. We readily spot them in others. How that coworker irrationally dismisses evidence that contradicts their position, or how a family member selectively remembers only information or misinformation that supports their harmful political views. But we tend to believe our own information processing is rational and objective. This bias blind spot creates a double barrier to changing minds. We're resistant to new information, and we don't even recognize our resistance as biased. The good news, and I don't want this segment to feel like a neurological dead end, is that our brains are remarkably adaptable through neuroplasticity. This isn't just about learning new skills. Our neural architecture physically reorganizes based on our experiences and mental activities. While initial belief formation creates strong neural pathways, repeated exposure to alternative viewpoints can gradually establish new pathways. This is why sudden conversion is rare, but gradual shifts in perspective are possible when someone is repeatedly exposed to new ideas in a non-threatening context. Research shows that successful mind changing almost never happens in a single conversation. Instead, it occurs through what I call incremental plausibility shifts, small adjustments in what someone considers possible or reasonable that eventually lead to larger belief changes. This explains why the drop a fact bomb and walk away approach to changing minds is almost always counterproductive. Facts matter, but only when presented within the context of existing belief systems, introduced gradually and reinforced through trusted sources. For those of us interested in effective communication, this has profound implications. If we genuinely want to influence others' thinking rather than simply win arguments, we need strategies that work with these psychological realities rather than against them. This means creating spaces where people can explore new ideas without feeling threatened, connecting new information to values they already hold, and recognizing that real belief change is almost always a gradual process rather than an immediate conversion. When we talk about changing minds, we have to acknowledge that there's a dark side to this process. Cults and extremist groups have developed highly sophisticated psychological techniques to fundamentally alter how people think, often with devastating consequences. I've spent years studying these methods not because I'm fascinated with the macabre, but because understanding the extreme end of persuasion helps us recognize subtler versions of the same techniques in our everyday life. The most effective cult indoctrination doesn't begin with bizarre requests or outlandish beliefs. It starts with something much more insidious, the manipulation of basic human needs. We all crave belonging, meaning, and certainty, especially during periods of personal transition or societal upheaval. Cult recruiters are experts at identifying vulnerability and positioning their group as the perfect solution. The initial interactions often feel overwhelmingly positive, what researchers call love bombing, creating an artificial, emotional high that bypasses critical thinking. This isn't just some simple manipulation, it's a calculated exploitation of our deepest psychological needs. It creates powerful emotional anchors for later control. What happens next? Cults systematically isolate members from outside influences, but they don't do this overtly at first. Instead, they gradually increase time commitments and create an insider-outsider dichotomy where only fellow members truly, quote, understand. This environmental control serves a critical purpose. It removes exposure to contradictory information at precisely the moment when the person might otherwise experience cognitive dissonance. Without external reality checks, even highly intelligent people can be led to accept increasingly extreme beliefs. This may feel especially relevant to our United States listeners this week. The language component of cult control deserves special attention because it's so pervasive yet often invisible to those inside the system. Cults develop what psychologists call loaded language, specialized jargon and thought-terminating cliches that short-circuit critical analysis. These aren't just words, they're cognitive containers that reshape how members perceive reality. When someone has been trained to automatically respond to doubts with phrases like, that's just your pride talking, or I'm only following orders, they're not just repeating mantras, they're actively blocking pathways of critical thought in their own minds. What many people don't realize is how seamlessly these techniques create a self-reinforcing system. Cults often incorporate practices that induce altered states of consciousness, whether through sleep deprivation, meditation, chanting, or emotionally intense ritual. These states make members more suggestible, while also providing powerful experiences that validate the group's teachings. When someone has a transcendent feeling during a ritual, and the cult framework is the only available explanation, the belief system becomes anchored in powerful emotional experiences rather than rational evaluation. The most troubling aspect of this process is how it fundamentally alters identity. Through a combination of confession rituals, public commitments, and incremental escalation of demands, cult members gradually replace their pre-cult identity with a new group identity. This identity fusion explains why exposure to contradictory facts rarely frees someone from cult influence. Because rejecting the belief system would mean rejecting their entire sense of self. The psychological cost becomes too high, which is why recovery from cult involvement typically requires extensive identity rebuilding. Researchers have interviewed numerous former cult members, and what strikes me most is how they describe not a sudden revelation, but a gradual awakening. Small inconsistencies accumulated until they just couldn't be rationalized away. This supports what researchers have found, that the most effective exit from thought control doesn't come from frontal assault on core beliefs, but from creating space for people to notice these contradictions themselves. When family members aggressively challenge cult beliefs, it typically triggers defensive reactions that strengthen commitment. Paradoxically, a gentler approach that maintains connection while asking thoughtful questions proves more effective. The parallels between cult techniques and certain religious extremism or political extremism are impossible to ignore, though I want to be careful not to paint all religious practices with the same brush. This distinguishing features aren't found in the specific beliefs, but in how those beliefs are maintained. When any group, religious or otherwise, prohibits questioning, isolates members from outside perspectives, uses fear and shame to enforce compliance, and equates doubt with moral failure, they're employing the same psychological architecture regardless of their ideology. The key distinction is whether adherence comes through free exploration and genuine conviction, or through systematic, controlled thought. Politics represents perhaps the most challenging domain for mind change in our current cultural landscape. We found that political beliefs aren't just opinions people hold. They're often intrinsic parts of how many people define themselves. This creates a unique psychological terrain where disagreement isn't perceived as a simple difference of perspective, but as a fundamental threat to identity. We can't meaningfully discuss changing political minds without first understanding the profound identity fusion that occurs in political belief systems. What makes political beliefs particularly resistant to change is that they're rarely isolated positions. They typically exist as interconnected networks tied to group affiliations, moral frameworks, and even our sense of safety in the world. When someone identifies strongly with a political, quote, tribe, their brain processes challenges to political positions as attacks on their brain imaging studies of political partisans show that when confronted with contradictory political information, they activate the same neurological regions associated with threats to physical safety. This isn't metaphorical. Their nervous systems literally respond as if they're being endangered. And when your brain perceives information as threatening your safety, rational evaluation becomes neurologically impossible. The concept that best captures this phenomenon is what researchers call identity protective cognition. This explains why presenting contradictory facts to a political partisan often backfires, strengthening rather than weakening their original position, a phenomenon known as the backfire effect. When someone's political belief is challenged, they experience that challenge as an assault on their community and their identity. Their brain responds not by weighing evidence, but by mounting a defense, recruiting motivated reasoning to protect their sense of self. We've observed that the stronger someone's political identity, the more pronounced this effect becomes, creating the paradoxical situation where those most certain of their positions are often the least able to process contradictory information. The Internet's lack of appropriate moderation has dramatically amplified these natural tendencies toward political entrenchment. The Internet doesn't just connect us with like-minded others. The underlying algorithms of monetarily driven websites and apps often function as unprecedented belief reinforcement machines. When content focuses on rage exploitation and not facts or societal care, the constant validation of bad ideas and misinformation can create an illusory sense of consensus, where we perceive our views as more widely shared than they actually are. This false consensus effect further calcifies our positions, as deviance from what we perceive as majority opinion carries psychological penalties. This can lead to algorithmically constructed reality bubbles where different segments of society operate with entirely different sets of facts. What I find particularly concerning about our current political landscape is how media ecosystems exploit these psychological vulnerabilities for clicks instead of reporting facts. Legacy media outlets increasingly employ emotionally provocative content that triggers threat responses, activating our limbic systems and bypassing critical thinking. When we're in a state of perpetual threat activation, our capacity for nuanced thinking diminishes dramatically. Psychological studies show that perceived threats narrow cognitive bandwidth and increase our preference for simplified black and white thinking. This creates a vicious cycle where threat-based political messaging makes us more susceptible to further polarization, which media outlets then exploit for engagement, creating an escalating spiral of entrenchment. The concept of sacred values offers another insight into political entrenchment. These are beliefs people hold as non-negotiable and inappropriate to question, different ordinary preferences or even strong opinions. When political positions become sacralized, they move from the realm of cost-benefit reasoning to moral absolutes. Research on moral psychology demonstrates that once a belief becomes a sacred value, suggesting compromise or trade-offs triggers moral outrage rather than thoughtful consideration. We see this increasingly in political discourse, where certain positions become litmus tests for group membership, immune from challenge even when evidence mounts against them. While research does suggest pathways for more productive political dialogue, the most effective being to create conditions where mind change becomes psychologically possible. In many parts of the world, those incremental changes won't occur fast enough to be beneficial to society. We'll cover what to do when a mind can't be changed later in the podcast. If you're in a situation where there is still time for change, then it starts with what psychologists call affirmation interventions, validating aspects of someone's identity unrelated to the political issue before discussing areas of disagreement. When people feel their broader identity is secure and respected, they become significantly more open to considering challenging information. Similarly, framing new information in ways that connect to existing values rather than threatening them can bypass defensive reactions. For example, research shows that conservatives become more receptive to climate policies when framed in terms of purity, patriotism, and market solutions rather than regulatory approaches. In our increasingly divided political world, many quick fix approaches that ignore the deep identity components of political belief are doomed to fail. The most successful instances of political mind change we've documented didn't come through debate victories, but through sustained relationships where trust allowed for gradual, face-saving shifts in perspective. There is a reason suppressive regimes and organizations target education. Education represents one of the most profound and yet frequently misunderstood mechanisms for changing minds. True education doesn't just add knowledge, it transforms the architecture of thought itself. The distinction between indoctrination and authentic education is important in understanding its mind-changing power. Indoctrination provides predetermined conclusions and discourages questioning, while genuine education equips people with the cognitive tools to evaluate evidence, recognize patterns, and draw their own conclusions. This distinction explains the striking correlation researchers have found between educational attainment and cognitive flexibility. When we learn to analyze multiple perspectives, evaluate competing evidence, and recognize the limitations of our knowledge, we develop intellectual humility, the understanding that our current beliefs are provisional rather than absolute. This cognitive stance makes substantive mind change possible in a way that mere exposure to contradictory facts does not. Education changes not just what we think, but how we think. Advanced education, especially in fields that emphasize systematic doubt and methodological skepticism, fundamentally rewires cognitive processing. Longitudinal studies tracking students through higher education show measurable increases in integrative complexity, the ability to recognize multiple dimensions of issues and synthesize seemingly contradictory perspectives. Individuals with higher integrative complexity are significantly more capable of changing their minds when evidence warrants, not because they hold their beliefs less strongly, but because they hold them differently. as working models rather than fixed truths. The content of education matters tremendously for mind change, but not in the way many assume. Simply presenting facts that contradict existing beliefs rarely produces significant attitude shifts. What's more effective is education that builds metacognitive awareness, the ability to think about our own thinking. When people learn about cognitive biases, motivated reasoning, and the social construction of knowledge, they gain tools to identify these patterns in themselves. Studies of science education show that teaching the process of knowledge construction, how we know what we know, produces greater openness to evidence than simply teaching established conclusions. This metacognitive approach helps explain why education correlates with decreased dogmatism across diverse domains from politics to religion. Historical examples illustrate education's transformative potential. Consider the dramatic shift in social attitudes towards homosexuality over recent decades. This change wasn't primarily driven by direct persuasion, but by educational exposure that humanized LGBTQ+ individuals and provided frameworks for understanding sexual orientation beyond simplistic moral binaries. Similarly, racial attitudes have been profoundly influenced by educational interventions that move beyond superficial diversity initiatives to explore systemic patterns and historical context. These examples demonstrate that education's mind-changing power comes not from forcing conclusions, but from expanding conceptual frameworks that allow people to reorganize existing knowledge and incorporate new information in meaningful ways. However, education's transformative potential faces significant challenges in our current information environment. The democratization of information through digital media has paradoxically made it easier for people to create insulated knowledge communities resistant to educational influence. When contradictory information is just a click away, the mere availability of alternative perspectives doesn't guarantee engagement with them. This explains why increased access to information hasn't automatically produced more shared understanding. Authentic education requires not just exposure to diverse viewpoints, but sustained engagement with them in contexts that support critical evaluation, something algorithmic news feeds and social media rarely provide, and something that is also under threat from the increasing use of AI to outsource our cognitive skills. Education systems themselves can sometimes undermine the very cognitive flexibility they aim to develop. When education becomes narrowly focused on standardized metrics or ideologically constrained, it can reinforce rather than challenge existing thought patterns. Educational environments promoting genuine inquiry produced markedly different cognitive outcomes than those emphasizing compliance or ideological conformity, regardless of the specific content being taught. The most mind-changing educational experiences involve productive struggle with complex problems, exposure to genuine intellectual diversity, and autonomy in reaching conclusions. These elements develop the cognitive muscles needed for meaningful belief revision throughout life. What's often overlooked in discussions of education and mind change is the role of timing and developmental readiness. The most profound educational transformations typically occur during periods of identity formation and life transition. This explains why collegiate education often produces significant belief changes. It coincides with a developmental period of identity exploration and occurs in a novel environment separated from previous social reinforcement. Understanding these developmental windows helps explain why similar educational content can have dramatically different effects depending on when and how it's encountered. The most effective educational intervention for changing minds account for these developmental factors rather than treating belief change as a purely rational process. Research suggests that education's mind-changing potential is greatest when it's approached not as a corrective to, quote, wrong thinking, but as an expansion of cognitive capacity. When education honors the lived experiences that shape existing beliefs, while introducing tools to examine those experiences from new perspectives, it creates conditions where mind change becomes a natural outgrowth, intellectual growth rather than a threatening demand. This approach requires humility from educators themselves, a recognition that the goal isn't to replace one set of certainties with another, but to develop the capacity for thoughtful, evidence-based revision of our beliefs over time. If you've been a previous listener to Cyberspace, then you know that this is about the point where most episodes would be ending. But we're about halfway through this longer episode. If you need to take a break, push pause and come back. Don't forget to subscribe too, so if life happens and you wander off, you can always get the next episode right when it drops. Identity may be the single most powerful force shaping human belief systems, yet it's routinely underestimated in our discussions about changing minds. We don't simply hold beliefs, we become them. Our core convictions, whether political, religious, or cultural, aren't separate from our sense of self. They're constitutive elements of who we understand ourselves to be. This identity belief fusion creates a psychological reality where challenges to our beliefs register in the brain, not as invitations to reconsider evidence, but as existential threats to our very being. The neuroscience behind identity protective cognition reveals just how fundamental this connection is. When researchers place people in brain imaging scanners and challenge their core beliefs, the brain regions that activate aren't primarily those involved in logical reasoning. Instead, we see heightened activity in regions associated with self-preservation, emotional regulation, and social identity. This isn't a quirk or a flaw in human psychology. It's a feature that evolved for good reason. Throughout human history, group belonging was essential for survival, and maintaining beliefs consistent with our community provided critical protection. Understanding this evolutionary background helps explain why even highly intelligent, otherwise rational people can become cognitively blind when core identity beliefs are challenged. What makes identity-based beliefs particularly resistant to change is that they're rarely isolated convictions. They typically exist as interconnected networks that provide meaning, purpose, and social connection. Take religious identity, for example. It often encompasses not just theological propositions, but ethical frameworks, community bonds, family traditions, and existential security. When someone challenges even a peripheral aspect of such an identity-based belief system, the perceived threat extends to this entire meaning-making structure. This explains why presenting contradictory evidence often backfires. The psychological cost of integration is simply too high, threatening not just one belief, but an entire scaffolding of personal meaning. Identity fusion creates particularly powerful resistance when it involves what psychologists call totalizing identities, those that provide comprehensive explanatory frameworks for understanding oneself and the world. Political extremism, fundamentalist religious movements, and certain philosophical communities can become totalizing in this way, creating closed epistemic systems where all information is filtered through the identity-based framework. What outsiders see as contradictions or failings, insiders interpret as confirmations or tests of faith. We've interviewed individuals across the spectrum of such totalizing belief systems, and what's striking is how similar the psychological mechanisms remain despite vast differences in specific content. The identity becomes self-reinforcing, constantly working to maintain internal coherence even as external contradictions mount. The social dimensions of identity-based belief systems create additional barriers to mind change. When beliefs are shared within communities, changing them carries the risk of rejection, marginalization, or complete expulsion from valued social groups. Researchers studying religious deconstruction, political apostasy, and ideological defection consistently find that the fear of social consequences often delays belief change long after the intellectual doubts have emerged. This helps explain the common pattern where people maintain public adherence to community beliefs while privately harboring growing skepticism. The psychological and social costs of alignment remain lower than the anticipated costs of authentic expression. Only when the dissonance becomes overwhelming do people typically risk the social consequences of belief change. What's interesting from a psychological perspective is how we maintain consistency between our actions and identity-based beliefs through bidirectional reinforcement. When we act in accordance with an identity, we strengthen our psychological commitment to it. Conversely, when we publicly defend a belief, we become more invested in its truth. This action belief cycle creates an escalating commitment that makes identity-based beliefs increasingly resistant to change over time. Consumer psychologists leverage this understanding in brand loyalty programs, but we see the same principles operating in religious rituals, political activism, and cultural practices. Each act of identity-consistent behavior deepens the psychological investment in the associated beliefs. In addition to what we've covered in previous segments about reinforcing someone's identity before challenging beliefs and letting them know they're psychologically safe, another promising approach involves helping people develop more complex, multifaceted identities. Research consistently shows that individuals with multiple sources of meaning and belonging demonstrate greater cognitive flexibility when any single identity component is challenged. This identity complexity creates psychological resilience that allows for more nuanced engagement with contradictory information. With individuals undergoing significant belief changes, those who successfully navigate the transition typically find ways to preserve valued aspects of their previous identity while integrating new elements, a process of identity evolution rather than identity replacement. Most importantly, meaningful engagement with identity-based beliefs requires profound humility. When we fail to recognize the identity dimensions of belief, we mistakenly approach conversations as though they were simply about evidence and reasoning. But for the person whose identity is implicated, the stakes are immeasurably higher. Effective engagement acknowledges this reality and proceeds with appropriate care, not avoiding challenges, but offering them in ways that create possibilities for growth rather than threats to existence. The most profound mind changes don't come through argument or evidence alone, but through relationships that provide both challenge and security, creating spaces where identity evolution becomes without triggering existential terror. Curiosity may be our most underappreciated psychological resource for changing minds, both our own and others. Research on cognitive flexibility found that genuine curiosity functions as a kind of psychological solvent, temporarily dissolving the rigid frameworks that otherwise lock our thinking in place. What makes curiosity so powerful isn't just that it motivates learning, it fundamentally alters our cognitive stance towards information. A curious mind approaches new ideas with provisional openness rather than immediate judgment, creating space for exploration before evaluation. This distinction explains why simply presenting contradictory evidence rarely changes minds, while invoking genuine curiosity often succeeds where direct persuasion fails. The neuroscience of curiosity offers fascinating insights into its mind-changing potential. When brain researchers track neural activity during states of curiosity, they observe increased connectivity between reward pathways and memory formation regions. This neurological signature helps explain why information encountered during periods of curiosity is processed differently. It's encoded more deeply, retained more accurately, and integrated more readily with existing knowledge structures. Even more remarkably, studies show that curiosity creates a lingering knowledge hunger that extends beyond the initial question, creating a temporary state of enhanced receptivity to related information. This curiosity spillover effect creates windows of opportunity where minds become unusually permeable to new perspectives. What's particularly striking is how curiosity bypasses many of the defensive mechanisms that normally prevent belief revision. When we're genuinely curious, identity protective cognition diminishes, confirmation bias weakens, and the threat response to contradictory information decreases. In experimental settings, researchers have found that simply inducing a state of curiosity through intriguing questions can significantly reduce political polarization on subsequently presented information. Similarly, when groups in conflict are guided to become curious about each other's perspectives rather than defensive of their own, the quality of dialogue transforms, creating opportunities for mutual understanding that adversarial approaches never achieve. The absence of curiosity may be as important as its presence in understanding why minds remain unchanged. Studies of dogmatism, the tendency to hold beliefs with rigid certainty, regardless of evidence, find that low curiosity is one of its defining features. Dogmatic individuals typically exhibit high need for closure and low need for cognition, preferring the comfort of certainty over the discomfort of ambiguity. This psychological profile creates profound resistance to new information, especially anything that might disrupt existing certainties. Understanding this connection helps explain why some individuals remain seemingly impervious to evidence. They're not necessarily less intelligent, but they are less curious, and that difference fundamentally shapes their information processing. The relationship between curiosity and humility deserves special attention, as these traits work synergistically to enable mind change. Intellectual humility, the awareness that our knowledge is limited and fallible, creates the psychological space for curiosity to emerge. Conversely, curiosity erodes the illusion of explanatory depth that makes us so overconfident in our understanding. This virtuous cycle explains why the most adaptable thinkers I've studied combine these traits. They remain aware of the boundaries of their knowledge while maintaining eager interest in what lies beyond those boundaries. The combination creates a cognitive profile that's simultaneously confident enough to hold provisional positions, but humble enough to revise them when warranted. Cultivating curiosity is remarkably straightforward in theory, yet challenging in practice. It requires creating environments where questions are valued as highly as answers. Educational research consistently shows that children naturally exhibit high curiosity, but many educational environments inadvertently suppress it by rewarding quick, correct answers rather than thoughtful exploration. The most effective approaches for sustaining curiosity emphasize authentic question generation, tolerate productive confusion, and create safe spaces for intellectual risk taking. These principles apply equally to self-directed learning across the lifespan. Maintaining curiosity requires deliberately cultivating comfort with not knowing as a precursor to deeper understanding. What I find most compelling about curiosity as a change agent is its intrinsic reward structure. Unlike many approaches to changing minds that rely on external persuasion, curiosity is inherently pleasurable. The brain's reward systems activate during curiosity satisfaction in patterns similar to other intrinsically motivating experiences. This pleasure creates a self-sustaining cycle where the rewards of exploration motivate further inquiry. We've observed this pattern repeatedly in individuals undergoing significant belief changes. They often describe not a reluctant admission of error, but an exciting journey of discovery. This intrinsic motivation helps explain why cultivating curiosity can succeed where external pressure fails. It transforms belief change from something done to us into something we actively pursue. The strategic implications of curiosity for dialogue across difference are profound but frequently overlooked. When we approach conversations with the goal of invoking curiosity rather than forcing agreement, the entire dynamic shifts. Questions that genuinely invite exploration, what led you to that conclusion, or how do you see the evidence differently than I do, create engagement rather than defensiveness. This approach doesn't avoid challenging assumptions, but it does so by sparking genuine wonder rather than triggering threat response. The most successful bridge builders aren't those with the most compelling arguments, but those who ask the most thought-provoking questions, creating spaces where curiosity becomes contagious and mutual exploration becomes possible. In our increasingly polarized world, curiosity may be our most valuable cognitive resource, not just for changing individual minds, but for maintaining the collective capacity for evidence-based belief revision. Cultivating curiosity at both personal and societal levels requires recognizing its value, not just for acquiring knowledge, but for remaining adaptable in a rapidly changing world. The curious mind is inherently anti-fragile, converting challenges to existing beliefs from threats to opportunities for growth. This resilience explains why fostering curiosity may be our most promising strategy for addressing the epistemic fracturing that threatens shared understanding in democratic societies. Propaganda represents the dark mirror of persuasion, a systematic effort to shape beliefs not through open inquiry but through psychological manipulation. Understanding propaganda is essential, not just for historical analysis, but for navigating our current information landscape. What makes propaganda particularly effective isn't brute force indoctrination, but its sophisticated exploitation of our natural cognitive tendencies. By working with rather than against our psychological biases, well-crafted propaganda can entrench beliefs so deeply that they become resistant to even overwhelming contradictory evidence. The psychological mechanisms that make propaganda effective are remarkably consistent across vastly different contexts. At its core, effective propaganda leverages our brain's reliance on cognitive shortcuts, what psychologists call heuristics. When information environments become complex or overwhelming, our brains naturally seek simplification through emotional associations, pattern recognition, and mental categorization. Propaganda exploits these tendencies through techniques like emotionally charged imagery, simplistic causal narratives, and consistent message repetition. You are seeing this week in the United States, or in fact for the last 2 weeks, if you've heard Republicans' propaganda repeating the phrase fraud, waste, and abuse over and over and over again, whether or not they're actually talking about something that would fit into those categories. They're staying on message. That's their propaganda. This appeals directly to the brain's preference for processing fluency, the ease with which information can be processed, which we often mistake for accuracy or truthfulness. Studies consistently show that merely repeating a claim increases its perceived credibility, regardless of its actual truth value, a phenomenon propagandists have exploited long before psychologists formally documented it. The exploitation of fear and threat perception forms another cornerstone of effective propaganda. When threat systems activate in the brain, cognitive processing fundamentally changes. We become hyper-vigilant to danger cues, more receptive to simplified solutions, and more willing to accept restrictions on freedom or critical thinking if they promise security. This explains why fear-based propaganda has been particularly effective during periods of social instability or perceived external threat. Historical examples abound, from the dehumanization campaigns that preceded genocides in the past to the security-focused messaging that justified civil liberties restrictions in multiple nations. The neuroscience is clear. Threat activation narrows cognitive bandwidth, capacity for nuanced analysis, precisely when such analysis is most needed. What many people fail to appreciate about modern propaganda is how sophisticated it has become in exploiting group identity dynamics. By framing issues in terms of in-group loyalty and out-group threat, propaganda creates powerful motivated reasoning effects where factual evaluation becomes secondary to group alignment. Brain imaging studies show that when we process information relevant to our political identity, the brain regions associated with group affiliation and emotional processing activate before those involved in analytical reasoning. Propaganda leverages this sequencing by ensuring that group identity cues precede factual claims, priming the brain to process subsequent information through an identity protective lens. This explains why propaganda often emphasizes symbols, flags, cultural markers before introducing specific claims. These identity triggers establish the processing framework for everything that follows. The digital transformation of propaganda presents unprecedented challenges because it combines traditional psychological techniques with algorithmic amplification and precise targeting. While propaganda has always targeted psychological vulnerabilities, modern data analytics allow for unprecedented precision in identifying and exploiting individual differences in susceptibility. Research on psychographic targeting demonstrates that personality traits like anxiety, openness, or need for cognitive closure significantly predict vulnerability to specific propaganda techniques. This allows propagandists to craft customized approaches for different audience segments, maximizing effectiveness by aligning techniques with psychological profiles. The algorithmic curation of content further amplifies these effects by creating reinforcing information environments where contradictory perspectives are systematically filtered out. What's concerning about contemporary propaganda is its increasing ability to hijack epistemic trust, our sense of what sources and processes reliably lead to truth. By systematically attacking the credibility of independent knowledge-producing institutions like science, journalism, and academia, modern propaganda creates what scholars call epistemic chaos, a state where no shared standards exist for evaluating factual claims. In this environment, truth becomes merely a function of tribal loyalty rather than independent evaluation. Research tracking information processing patterns shows that once this epistemic collapse occurs, restoring evidence-based belief formation becomes extraordinarily difficult, as the very mechanisms for distinguishing reliable from unreliable sources have been compromised. The most effective countermeasures against propaganda don't focus on debunking specific claims, but on building general resilience through what media researchers call prebunking, or inoculation approaches. Just as vaccines work by exposing the immune system to weakened pathogens, cognitive inoculation works by exposing people to weakened versions of propaganda techniques, creating psychological antibodies against future manipulation. Studies consistently show that understanding the mechanisms of propaganda, the specific techniques used to manipulate belief, provides significantly more protection than counter-arguments alone. This explains why the most effective media literacy programs focus on recognition of propaganda techniques rather than simply providing accurate information. Historical examples offer both cautionary tales and reasons for measured optimism. The propaganda machinery of totalitarian regimes demonstrates the devastating effectiveness of these techniques when deployed with state power and without competing voices. Yet the same historical record shows that propaganda's effectiveness diminishes when people retain access to diverse information sources and basic critical thinking skills. This understanding guides contemporary approaches to countering propaganda, focusing on preserving information diversity, supporting independent knowledge-producing institutions, and building general-purpose critical evaluation skills that work across specific content domains. Building societal resilience against propaganda requires recognizing that this isn't simply about them manipulating us, it's about developing collective awareness of how all persuasive communication, including messages we agree with, can exploit psychological vulnerabilities. The most sophisticated understanding of propaganda acknowledges that we're all susceptible to these influence techniques, regardless of intelligence or education. The critical distinction isn't between those who are manipulated and those who aren't, but between those who cultivate awareness of these processes and those who remain blind to them. This recognition represents perhaps our best defense against propaganda's entrenchment of beliefs. Not immunity to influence, which is impossible, but conscious engagement with how our beliefs are shaped by the information ecosystems we inhabit. Despite our best understanding of psychology and the most skillful application of persuasive techniques, there are circumstances where attempting to change someone's mind becomes futile or even counterproductive. Acknowledging these limitations isn't defeatist, it's psychologically realistic and strategically necessary. Not every belief is amenable to change at every moment, and understanding when to engage and when to disengage represents its own form of wisdom. Timing is perhaps the most underappreciated factor in determining whether mind change is possible. Beliefs aren't static entities, but dynamic systems that go through periods of both rigidity and malleability. Research on unfreezing suggests that major life transitions, identity disruptions, and moments of acknowledged failure create windows where previously entrenched beliefs become temporarily open to revision. Conversely, periods of heightened threat, uncertainty, or identity challenge typically increase belief rigidity as a psychological defense mechanism. We've observed repeatedly that identical persuasive approaches can yield dramatically different results depending on where someone is in this cycle of belief stability. Attempting to change minds during periods of maximum defensiveness isn't just ineffective, it often triggers what psychologists call the backfire effect, where challenges actually strengthen the original belief. Certain psychological states create nearly impenetrable barriers to belief change, regardless of the evidence presented. Psychological reactance, the motivational state that arises when people feel their freedom is threatened, creates automatic resistance to persuasion that operates below conscious awareness. Once reactance activates, even the most compelling evidence tends to be rejected or distorted. Similarly, when beliefs are maintained primarily through cognitive dissonance resolution, where accepting contradictory evidence would require acknowledging painful mistakes or moral failures, direct challenges often strengthen rather than weaken commitment. We can see this in the debate around mask wearing, where even though the science has shown time and again that masks are the best defense against respiratory illnesses, people who have not been wearing them have trouble letting go of their belief that the mask is unimportant because it requires acknowledging that they may have harmed the people around them or in their life. It's understandable, if frustrating. These psychological mechanisms explain the paradoxical pattern where those with the most demonstrably false beliefs sometimes respond to contradictory evidence with increased rather than decreased certainty. The social costs of belief change create another category of situations where persuasion attempts may be futile, regardless of their psychological sophistication. When changing a belief would result in community rejection, family estrangement, or loss of social identity, the barriers to acceptance become immense. Psychologists work with individuals across the political and religious spectrum who privately acknowledge doubts about community dogmas but remain publicly committed because the social price of dissent feels unbearable. These situations illustrate that beliefs aren't just psychological constructs, but social technologies that maintain friendships and relationships and group memberships. Until alternative social connections become available, challenging these socially embedded beliefs often proves futile regardless of the evidence presented. Power dynamics between the would-be persuader and the other person create additional context where mind-changing efforts may be inappropriate or counterproductive. When persuasion attempts occur within significant power differentials, a boss to an employee, a teacher to a student, parent to a child, psychological reactance intensifies, and what might otherwise be experienced as dialogue instead feels like coercion. Similarly, historical patterns of dismissal or marginalization between identity groups create contexts where even well intentioned persuasion may be experienced as an extension of epistemic domination. Work in facilitating cross group dialogue has repeatedly shown that establishing conversational equity and addressing historical power imbalances must precede any meaningful exchange of perspectives. Personality factors create yet another set of conditions where traditional mind changing approaches may fail. Extensive research on the quote, Big Five personality traits shows that individuals scoring high in trait consciousness and low in openness to experience demonstrate significantly greater resistance to belief change across almost all domains. This doesn't mean change isn't possible, but it does mean that the threshold of evidence required is substantially higher, and the process typically takes much longer. For individuals with these personality profiles, approaches focusing on gradual exposure and practical consequences prove more effective than those emphasizing novelty or conceptual elegance. Understanding these personality differences helps explain why persuasive approaches that work brilliantly with some individuals fail consistently with others, regardless of specific content. In situations where traditional persuasion appears futile, alternative approaches focused on harm reduction rather than belief change may prove more constructive. Rather than trying to change the core belief, an effort likely to trigger defensiveness and backfire effects, these approaches focus on modifying the behavioral consequences of the belief or establishing boundaries that limit its impact on others. When someone holds dangerous conspiracy theories that appear impervious to evidence, for instance, focusing on preventing harmful actions rather than changing the underlying belief often proves more effective in the short term. This pragmatic approach doesn't abandon the possibility of eventual belief change, but prioritizes concrete harm prevention over ideological conversion. Similarly, boundary setting approaches recognize that while we can't control others' beliefs, we can establish clear parameters around how those beliefs affect our interactions. When relationships involve seemingly immovable beliefs that create ongoing conflict, explicit agreements about what topics remain off limits or how disagreements will be handled when they arise can preserve connection while acknowledging the limits of persuasion. Psychologists have guided many families through this process of establishing rules of engagement that allow relationships to continue despite deep ideological differences. These approaches don't resolve the underlying disagreements, but create containers where connection can exist alongside them. What I find most important to emphasize is that recognizing the futility of certain persuasion attempts doesn't mean accepting a post-truth world where beliefs are immovable and evidence doesn't matter. Rather, it means developing a sophisticated understanding of the complex psychological, social, situational factors that influence receptivity to new information. Sometimes the wisest course isn't trying harder to change a currently immovable belief, but creating conditions where that belief might become more amenable to reconsideration in the future. This strategic patience, knowing when to engage, when to disengage, and how to maintain connection across difference, represents a more nuanced approach to navigating our increasingly fractured epistemic landscape. As we conclude our exploration of the psychology of changing minds, I'm struck by how this seemingly simple process, encountering new information and updating our beliefs, turns out to be one of the most complex and fascinating aspects of human psychology. Throughout this episode, we've examined the neurological, psychological, social, and even evolutionary factors that influence our capacity for belief revision. What emerged isn't a simple formula for changing minds, but a richer understanding of the intricate dance between cognitive architecture, identity needs, and social dynamics that shapes how we make sense of the world. What I find compelling about this subject is the fundamental tension it reveals in human cognition. Our brains evolved both to seek truth and to maintain social cohesion, goals that sometimes align but often conflict. The psychological mechanisms that make us resistant to changing our minds, cognitive dissonance, identity protection, confirmation bias, aren't design flaws but adaptive features that helped our ancestors maintain group belonging in environments where social exclusion would be fatal. At the same time, our capacity for curiosity, evidence evaluation, and belief revision gave us unprecedented adaptive flexibility as a species. This dual heritage creates the central paradox of human reasoning. We are simultaneously truth seekers and tribal defenders, capable of both remarkable intellectual flexibility and astounding resistance to evidence. Understanding this tension helps explain why changing minds is not simply about presenting better facts or more compelling arguments. When we approach disagreements as though they were purely about information processing, we miss the profound identity and emotional dimensions that shape how information is received. I've seen the most skillful communicators recognize that effective persuasion requires engaging not just with what someone thinks, but with who they understand themselves to be. The speed of our current information environment adds additional layers of complexity to these already challenging dynamics. We're evolutionarily equipped for belief revision at the pace of face to face conversation and gradual cultural evolution, not the torrent of contradictory claims and tribal signaling that characterize modern media ecosystems. The acceleration of information flow without corresponding evolution in our cognitive architecture helps explain the intensification of belief entrenchment and polarization we observe across many societies. Our psychological hardware simply hasn't evolved to process information at the speed and volume our technological infrastructure now delivers it. This mismatch between cognitive architecture and information environment makes understanding the psychology of belief change more important than ever before. As we've explored throughout this episode, different mechanisms dominate belief maintenance in different domains. Recognizing these domain-specific patterns helps explain why approaches that effectively change minds in one area fail completely in another. The person who readily updates their scientific understanding based on new evidence might show remarkable resistance to rethinking their political positions, not because of inconsistency, but because different psychological systems govern belief maintenance in these domains. What gives me hope amid these complexities is the evidence that we can develop metacognitive awareness of these processes. While we can't eliminate the psychological tendencies that sometimes make changing minds difficult, we can become more conscious of how they operate in ourselves and others. This awareness doesn't guarantee belief accuracy, but it does create the possibility of more intentional engagement with our own cognitive processes. We've observed that individuals who develop this metacognitive stance, this ability to think about their own thinking, demonstrate greater capacity for evidence-based belief revision across domains, not just because they eliminate biases, but because they learn to recognize and compensate for them. Educational approaches that cultivate these metacognitive skills represent one of our most promising pathways for enhancing collective belief revision capacities. On a personal level, I've found that the most profound mind changes often happen not through dramatic confrontations, but through sustained exposure to alternative perspectives in contexts of psychological safety. The psychological insights we've explored throughout this episode can be used to either enhance or undermine human autonomy. When applied with respect for others' agency and dignity, understanding these processes can create spaces for more authentic belief formation and revision. When weaponized to manipulate or control, these same insights become tools of psychological exploitation. I believe we have a collective responsibility to develop frameworks for ethical persuasion that harness these psychological principles while respecting fundamental human dignity and agency. As we conclude this episode, I hope this exploration of the psychology of changing minds provides both practical insights and a deeper appreciation for the remarkable complexity of human cognition. Our capacity for both belief revision and belief persistence, for both rational evaluation and identity protection, reflects the intricate evolutionary forces that shape our minds. Understanding these dynamics won't make changing minds easier, whether our own or others, but it does make the process more navigable, more respectful, and ultimately more aligned with our shared pursuit of understanding in this uncertain world. It remains our greatest protection against both blind certainty and cynical dismissal, the twin enemies of genuine understanding. Thanks for listening to this episode of PsyberSpace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off and reminding you to stay curious. Before you go, I would like to inform you that the length of this episode was by request from some of our avid listeners. Let me know how you liked a longer episode. And I may do more in the future, probably once every few months, not as a regular occurrence. The 25-minute episodes are our sweet spot. Thanks for listening.